This is Matthew Kratter's Bitcoin University. Today I want to talk about how Bitcoin defunds war. This is based on a great article from Alex Gladstein that was published a couple years ago. It's called The Invisible Cost of War in the Age of Quantitative Easing. I learned a lot from this article, and I'm going to link to it in the description notes below, so you can read it if you want to as well. So what do you need if you want to fight a war? You need people. This is traditionally solved by the draft, conscription, though no longer in places like the US, which no longer has the draft. You also need a lot of money, which can be procured through higher taxes or government borrowing, or a combination of the two. Here's the percentage of U.S. war costs that were paid by U.S. taxes. World War I, 30% was paid for by taxes. World War II, 50% was paid for by taxes. And the Korean War, 100% was funded by U.S. taxpayers. The rest was traditionally paid for by issuing special bonds at the time, which were called war bonds or liberty bonds, for example, during the two World Wars. World War I is a great example of how this combination of higher government taxes and borrowing worked. And what follows here is a quote from Alex Gladstein's article where he's quoting someone else. Alcohol, tobacco, jewelry, cameras, cosmetics, chewing gum, and many others came in for new or increased taxes. This was at the time of World War I when the U.S. entered the war. Income taxes, now possible because of the 16th Amendment, were raised. The highest rate was 67%. The Treasury, the U.S. Treasury, also made efforts to encourage people to buy bonds through a national campaign based on patriotism. Giant rallies were held in which celebrities, including Hollywood stars, urged people to support the war effort by buying the bonds. So this is how wars should be fought and funded, in my opinion, through taxes and through very obvious borrowing schemes. And here's why: because the more directly and transparently citizens themselves bear the costs of a war, for example, friends and family members dying, though it's a terrible thing to say, higher taxes, making financial sacrifices to buy war bonds to help the government, the more directly and transparently citizens bear these costs, the more likely people are to pressure their leaders to avoid unnecessary wars, to keep necessary wars as short as possible, and also to fight wars as cost efficiently as possible. Now, here in the 21st century, war is the complete opposite of this, thanks to the move in 1971 to fiat money when Nixon took the U.S. off the gold standard. This actually happened 53 years ago, yesterday on August 15th, 1971, when the U.S. left the gold standard. If you're enjoying this video so far, please help to support the channel. Hit the subscribe button, leave a like, leave a comment, and share this video with a friend or family member. Now, over the past few decades, U.S. politicians have figured out that it's much easier to fight wars if you can fool voters into believing that the wars have no cost to them. The first step, get rid of the draft so that the elites won't have to sacrifice their children. Normally, the elites get out of serving anyway, but this would be one step. Then create a massive marketing recruitment machine that focuses on brainwashing the poor, the working class, and minorities. These recruitment channels become especially important if you know that you're going to offend traditional military families by making the U.S. military more and more woke every couple of years. Next steps, if you want to fight a war and not have the people notice, don't raise taxes to fight your war, or taxpayers will revolt. You probably also shouldn't ask people to buy liberty bonds or freedom bonds or war bonds, because you've already taught them in school how evil America is and how it's probably not worth fighting for. Also, you may accidentally remind Americans how funding wars in far-flung regions of the world doesn't actually make Americans more safe. So instead, what you do is you just borrow some money without asking for permission. You just issue some extra government bonds, some U.S. treasuries, like you do for regular budget items. And there's only one small problem here. When a government borrows a lot of money, it drives up interest rates. Increasing the supply of bonds drives down the prices of those bonds, which increases yields and interest rates. This is how issuing more paper drives up interest rates. And this makes it more difficult for people to afford houses and cars and their credit card bills. So they may wake up and start to notice. And eventually, if things get bad enough, they're going to vote you out at the ballot box. So how do you prevent interest rates being driven up by the huge increase in issuance of government bonds? That's easy. You just have your central bank print up the money and buy the government bonds, and then your problem is solved, at least temporarily. You now have almost endless funding that can be used to fund endless wars. Society in general doesn't seem to care about poor people becoming cannon fodder. Your average Harvard or Stanford grad is never going to join the military, for example. And the costs of war have now been hidden as well. This is exactly what we've seen so far in the 21st century with the war on terror. It's especially convenient for a government to have a very amorphous enemy to fight, because then the war can run on for decades and decades, like the war on drugs, for example, the war on terror. Who exactly is this terror? Is it people like Osama bin Laden and Saddam Hussein? It's great to have people like this because you can initially fill up your government budget with programs to fund and train them, and then later you can turn on them and fill up your government budget with programs to kill them, all the while telling the American people that you're making them safer. More U.S. government military spending means more people get expensive homes in the Washington, D.C. suburbs. So if you don't increase taxes or annoy people with war bonds, it becomes possible to fund wars that last decades and enrich one politician, one political generation after another. And even the nightly news will stop covering these wars and Americans will forget that they exist. This is exactly what happened over the past 2 decades with the war on terror. It was funded by the Fed, keeping interest rates low for an extended period of time while printing up new dollars to buy U.S. government bonds in order to keep interest rates low in a war environment. And in the aftermath of the war, we can see how low interest rates were following the great financial crisis for much of the early 2010s. And we can also see what the central bank in the US, what the Federal Reserve did in the wake of the great financial crisis. It increased its balance sheet from somewhere around 1 trillion up to about 9 trillion. Up to about 5 or 6 trillion worth of US treasuries, which they've been slowly letting roll off their balance sheet. But this is what happens when you want to fund trillion-dollar wars without increasing taxes and without issuing war bonds. And keeping interest rates low for an extended period of time in the 2010s led to many distortions in the capital markets and allowed the U.S. government to put even more spending items like more wars and more covert actions on its credit card. While one Hydra head of the government, the U.S. Treasury, was selling bonds, another Hydra head of the government, the Federal Reserve, the central bank, was buying those same bonds. Now, there's no free lunch in economics, and the price to be paid for the Fed monetizing deficit spending in this way is much higher inflation, which we've been experiencing really since 2021. The nice thing about inflation, though, is that it's a fairly invisible enemy. Many people don't understand that inflation is a result of central bank money printing and monetizing government deficits. So if you're a politician, you're very free to blame landlords or grocery stores or oil companies or your political opponents for the inflation. The one thing you should never do is blame the central bankers or the military-industrial complex for these wars. You should never blame the inflation on them. And the one thing that most Democrat and Republican politicians always agree on is that you must never call out those central bankers. There have been a few exceptions over the past 2 decades, like Ron Paul and Thomas Massie. Thomas Massie just introduced the Federal Reserve Board Abolition Act, H.R. 8421. Americans would be better off if the Federal Reserve did not exist. The Fed devalues our currency by monetizing the debt, causing inflation. This is one congressperson who actually understands how the economy works. So in conclusion, if you want to drastically reduce the number of wars, their scope, and their cost, you need to force your government onto a hard money standard or trick your government into a hard money standard. When governments had to accumulate stockpiles of gold, for example, in order to fund wars, there were many fewer and less destructive wars. When a population bears the burden of war, either through higher taxes or by essentially being forced to purchase war bonds, they're going to be less likely to get behind wars that are not strictly necessary and existential to the country in question. So Bitcoin Standard will not end all wars, but it will help to defund those endless wars and military operations that are being fought without the public paying attention or directly bearing the financial cost of those wars, though we all bear the cost of those wars indirectly in the form of secular inflation. On a Bitcoin standard, governments would need to accumulate large amounts of Bitcoin to pay for wars, and central banks would need to accumulate large amounts of Bitcoin to buy government bonds. And because Bitcoin is so difficult to confiscate, governments would need to listen more closely to their voters' demands and make a persuasive case for when war is absolutely necessary. If you asked Americans whether they prefer spending on domestic items like roads, upgrading infrastructure, etc., or forever wars in far-flung locations that serve mostly to enrich the military-industrial complex, you can be pretty sure that they will always choose the former over the latter. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit the subscribe and like buttons. Hit the notification bell if you want to be notified when I publish my next video. And let me know your questions and comments in the comment section below. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.